One of the other things I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about, because we talked about it earlier, was when the residency training programs were initially established, it was recommended that they be 3 years in length, and the first ones were Calgary and Western. I think it was in '71 that a decision was made to reduce the length of training to 2 years. And I've seen the arguments in the board minutes and so on, but I wondered if you could comment, if obviously you were part of that decision because you were running a training program. But
that's right. Yeah. Well, that was a meeting in Winnipeg, and an unforgettable meeting because there was quite a divided opinion across the country. Some of the other programs like Calgary and McMaster and so on and Western started off with 3-year programs, so that it was a good debate, a good honest debate, and I think the decision to stick it to 2 years, at least in the beginning, which was really the decision that was made, was for now, let's say 2 years is required, was simply because we felt we wouldn't have a lot of funding available to us, and we wanted to make family medicine training at the postgrad level available to as many students as wanted it. And therefore, if you had a 2-year program, you could accommodate more students than if it was a 3-year program, because you could use the same amount of funding. And I think that was a big factor in the decision. None of us had enough experience academically at that point in time to know whether 2 years or 3 years were best academically. And I think the way it's evolved with so many students now taking a 3rd-year program for extra training in emergency medicine or parts of the discipline that they really want to be particularly good at, has proven the fact that it was really quite a difficult decision at the time we made it in 1971.
Right. Okay. I think in 1971 was the time when you made this transition from being chair of a department to becoming a program director.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you talk a bit about your role as program director at the University of Toronto and the early growth of the department and the program?
Yes, it was a wonderful experience. I think we discovered early on that it was very difficult to train family physicians totally in the downtown Toronto environment, in the family practice units, because no matter how hard you tried, the care in downtown Toronto was split up. I mean, there were specialty hospitals like sick children's where the kids would go and so on that fragmented the care. And it was quite a contrast, for example, to my private practice in Mississauga, where when I was reviewed, I think, by the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario at one point in the 1970s, they discovered that I was looking after, in my practice, 97% of my patients were intact family groups. In other words, I was looking after everybody in the family. If the woman was pregnant, I was delivering her. I was looking after the kids that I delivered. I looked after mom and dad. And so you couldn't replicate that in downtown Toronto because the care was just by the nature of the environment too fragmented. Yeah. So that led us to establish teaching practices, and not just in urban areas, but in suburban areas and in rural areas. We had teaching practice up in Sioux Lookout in northwestern Ontario. We had teaching practices in some of the towns around the Toronto region. The residents really liked those experiences. So they became electives usually in the 2nd year of the program. And I think that strengthened the training that we were giving them, that they got some community experience where they got a more comprehensive experience at what family practice was like.
Okay. So I'll ask you a question now that we didn't talk about before, but it's just been one that nags at me all the time. When I looked at the curricula for Calgary and Western, 1966, when they started their training programs, there was a 3-year training program. Calgary managed to find 2.5 months of family medicine content in that 3 years. The rest was all hospital-based. And Western went with 6 months of family medicine in 3 years. So really not a large component of the training program. I was a bit surprised. And then when initial standards for the 2-year training program were established, 4 months of block time family medicine, and then 9 months of continuity of care. The idea being that you'd have at least 13 months of experience in family medicine over 2 years, more than half. And now, really, family medicine in many programs is horizontal, and it's throughout the 2 years of the training program. Do you have any thoughts about, the importance of training physicians in the context in which they're going to practice versus gathering the clinical competence that people need that maybe they can only achieve in hospital? It's a...
It has to be a balance. You're right. It has to be a balance, but we had built right in the continuity of care at the U of T program right from the beginning. So they came back, I think, a half a day a week or twice a week, in which they had a group of patients that they acquired that they looked after over the 2 years.
Right.
And of course that got broken up if they went out on a teaching practice to some other location in the second year, but the different things would interrupt it. But generally speaking, it did at least give them a chance to experience continuity of care. And I think that's really important. And you can't get that if you're just doing block rotations in various specialties, like a rotating internship, for example.
Right.
So I think that that was in our minds right from the get-go, but it sounds as if they're doing a better job at it now than we were able to do back in the 1970s and 80s.